It was a year ago today that we actually had our inaugural halaqa for the Usuli Institute, which is amazing. I was looking at the calendar, I was like, oh my god, how did we pass a year already? And a lot has happened, and I'm really happy to say, we have struck a chord, I think, with people, and we have a lot of people who are very interested and write us very lovely messages about how happy they are that we're doing what we're doing. And quite frankly, it's like when we started this, we really had no idea whether anyone would really even care about what we were doing. I hope that we have tried to do our best in being sort of the voice of beauty and reasonableness and depth of knowledge, and how important that is in affecting how we understand Islam and how we live that in our day-to-day. And we've made modest progress in the year. People have asked, how are we doing? And so when I look on YouTube and I see that, we've probably averaged about 2 educational events per month, so it's about 24 months. And we've had about 21,500 views, which is, not a whole lot, but if you think about it, it's about 900 people per session, which is pretty good. If you can fill an auditorium of 900 people every time you have an event, that's a pretty good thing. And also about 60 people a day. So, if you think about it, if we haven't been doing this, then those are people that really have not had a chance to learn something or hopefully been inspired. So, and I'm so grateful, that we're here and we're continuing. This is a labor of love. And for those of you who are new to what we do here at the Institute, this library and this backdrop and what we do is really kind of a formalization of a lifelong work and a dedication to books and knowledge, and trying to show that, there is so much beauty in this tradition. And one of the things that I'm personally very grateful for, and sort of an unintended outcome, was that at the beginning of each of these halaqas, I've had a chance to kind of share some thoughts and stories and ideas, and about how kind of this work has changed my life. Because I'm not a scholar, as I often say, but what really matters to me is, what does it really mean to be Muslim in 2018? Like, we know that core to Islam is beauty and love and mercy and compassion and justice and all of the beautiful qualities. But what does that really mean for me living as a Muslim? And so I've had, I was sort of shy to speak at the very beginning, and I kind of went back and played back some of the early halaqas, and I was like, oh, as my son would say, he's 13, that's so cringeworthy. So I had to look at myself and like, oh my god, okay, this is sort of embarrassing. Because when I started speaking, it was like, well, I didn't really feel like I had a right to say anything, and I kind of, wanted to defer to my husband, the scholar. And I was really, grateful that people came forward and said, the piece that you add is actually really valuable. And speaking as a woman and as a convert and kind of as a non-scholar, so, I wanted to take that opportunity to, kind of tell sort of the personal stories. So I decided that, okay, in the last month, if I'm really grateful for this experience, because it's I think, for Muslim organizations, it is unusual for women to be able to speak out. And unfortunately, and I hope that that will change in the future, but I hope, I want to try and set a better example. So I decided, okay, I needed to become a better public speaker. So last month I read a book on TED Talks, and I started watching TED Talks online. Do people know what TED Talks are? They're amazing. If you don't know what they are, they're like short, very powerful videos that took advantage of YouTube. And so the premise was that we would get the experts in every field, and people can kind of express the essence of what their specialty is in about 20 minutes or less. And it's for non-specialists, so they can really understand, like, okay, if you're going to talk about whatever topic you are a specialist in, that you can just share the gold from that. So I started by looking at, what are the top 25 TED Talks of all time. And I saw that in the top 5, there was one called The Power of Vulnerability. So I thought, oh, that's really interesting. It's a woman named Brene Brown, and you can look it up. It's sort of interesting. Her research is, she's a social worker, and she studies human connectedness. So she's really interested in, like, how do we increase things like empathy and courage and humanity, and it's like, oh, that's the kind of stuff we talk about here. So I definitely wanted to hear what she had to say. So in a nutshell, it's a really interesting talk, and she's funny and all of that stuff. It's engaging. So her research is that in understanding human connectedness, she was able to do a lot of research and kind of parse people into 2 groups. So the people that were really good at feeling connected to humanity were the people who felt worthiness or worthy to be loved. And the people who felt like they had issues with human connectedness were people who didn't feel worthy to be loved. And it was really just that one variable that made the difference between the two. And that people who didn't feel worthy had struggled with shame and fear and sort of this idea of extreme vulnerability. So she really wanted to kind of delve deeper into that and say, okay, well, what is it that makes people feel worthy? So she kind of set aside the group that struggles with shame and fear and says, okay, well, let's look at the group that feels worthy. And what is it about them that makes them feel able to feel connected? And it was this issue of vulnerability. So, and authenticity. And so her argument is, if you want to live a full life, you should live as your authentic self. You should be able to feel vulnerable, and you should live loving with your whole heart, which sounds very good, and it's very nice for people who already feel that they're worthy to be loved, because most likely they're people who are fairly comfortable in their skin. They don't really have, they feel like they can love people and they can take risks. But for the people that she set aside, which were the people that dealt with shame and fear, you really can't just tell them, you should just start feeling less vulnerable. You should embrace your vulnerability. You should just believe that you need to be loved. So, but she kind of set them aside and kind of kept going from there. And I thought, okay, well, that's interesting. So I'll come back to that research in a bit. Secondly, in about the last week or so, separate story that will kind of connect. I had a friend on Facebook who invited me, a Muslim friend, who invited me to like his new page, and it's called Loominary, Loominary. And the premise of that is that we live in an age where we are more connected than ever before, but we feel more lonely than ever before. And, why is that? It's because, and there's a video that kind of describes what they're trying to do, and it's like the idea of neoliberalism and storytelling. So we live in an age of neoliberalism, which means extreme individualism, where society is the market, and we as individuals are commodities, and we're trying to sell ourselves because we're taking pictures and selfies and trying to get likes and shares, and that, through that whole process, we're feeling sort of an emptiness. And then he comes to this and says, the way that we deal with this is we want to create a vehicle where people can share their stories. So they want to use the online vehicle and say, we really want to be authentic, again. We want to show vulnerability, and we want to create community, or again, the idea of human connectedness. So it's really interesting because, the first Brene, the TED Talk was from 2010, and she's had 37 million plus views. So clearly somebody, people are very interested in this idea of how do we create connectedness and meaning and authenticity and, and vulnerability. And those same words are now used in this new effort here in 2018, and trying to use that vehicle to share stories. So I thought, these are interesting efforts, and I wanted to comment on them from a Muslim perspective, because as a Muslim, when I watch these things, the one thing that just screams out to me is you're missing the role of God and the role of the divine and divinity in this process. For Muslims, obviously that's something that's very important because, especially here with the work we do, God is sort of the beginning and the end, and it's, God is your partner, and God is, your power, and it's kind of like asking you to look for authenticity or seek something and not really having, eyes. So, it's, when we talk about things like authenticity from a Muslim perspective, for me, authenticity is about understanding your true self and knowing, what are the God-given gifts that you have? What are your strengths, your weaknesses? Interestingly, when we were doing this halaqa a few months ago over the summer, I asked people, here, how many people know what your gifts are or what your purpose is, your God-given gifts? And I was really surprised that in a room like this size, I think only 2 people raised their hands. So let me ask you guys here, how many people here feel like you know what your God-given gift is, your purpose here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 4.5. Okay. Well, to believe as, one of the things that really made me fall in love with Islam was this idea that, everyone has a purpose, a God-given strength and a God-given gift. You have strengths and you have weaknesses. And so the first thing in trying to understand what is your authentic self and what is that true your true self is you have to know yourself. And we know from our tradition that if you want to know your God, you begin by knowing yourself. So, this is like, okay, do you have the soul of an artist, but you're trying to become a doctor, or you're being forced to be an engineer because you feel like for whatever reason that's what you need to do. Part of it is understanding, like, what are your special talents? What are your special gifts? What are the things that you're good at and you're passionate about? So that's sort of, to me, like the idea of authenticity. Moving to vulnerability, I see it as sort of the flip side of that same coin. And vulnerability is sort of the idea of being honest with yourself and understanding not just what you're good at, but who you are as a person. What is your accountability? What are you capable of in terms of creating good and not creating good? So as an example, when I became Muslim, one of the really important things that Dr. Abul guided me through in trying to find out who I was is really taking a actually I'm going to quote AA, which is a wonderful model for, I think, a way of understanding yourself as a person. A fearless moral inventory, and understanding what are those things that you actually avoid that make you feel vulnerable. And it's like taking that stuff and confronting it head on. So it's like, what is it that, for example, you have a tendency to do? Or that, okay, well, let me make it a real example. So I had a problem with always seeing myself as the victim in any situation. It was much easier for me to blame, whatever happened on someone else and not accept my own responsibility or accountability in that. And that became sort of a means for shame and covering up, because anytime I would do something I didn't want to accept responsibility for it, I would blame someone else and shove it under the rug. And part of becoming that authentic, honest self who is capable of vulnerability is confronting that shame and that fear and saying, okay, I am responsible for what I do. It's owning my accountability for who I am and saying, I can confront the sins that I've done and who I've hurt and what my role is in that, so I can learn that I'm not going to do that anymore, and I'm going to own it, and I'm going to overcome it, and I'm going to be a better person. And then you're able to be more vulnerable because you can be the first one to say, I'm an idiot. I'm responsible for this. And it frees you. It's like when people say the truth will set you free. That exercise, is an exercise in owning vulnerability. And all of that, so we talk, all of this is really just to say, change in our world really starts with changing ourselves. And we hear this all the time. But we have to start by understanding who are authentic, who we are, what our purpose is, what we're here for, what we have to contribute, and then what our vulnerability is. What are we ashamed of? What are we afraid of? And let's own it, clear it out. And then from that, then you can start building human connectedness. So, God plays a role because this is what God asks us to do. God asks us to be honest. God asks us to understand that, God created us to be beautiful, godly beings. God gave us, more than enough to be, to create goodness, and also the ability to create, darkness. But if we own that, then we can rise above it and start to connect with other human beings. So I think that, and then the last thing is just that, there really is no substitute for human connectedness. I think that in an age where everything is digital and online, you really have to make an effort to connect with human beings. And, I find a lot of pleasure in trying to make people smile, like when I just deal with them, even walking across the street and seeing someone or opening a door for someone, because I feel like in an age where I'm always looking at my phone, it means so much to me when I can actually make someone smile. And I think you can't really make someone smile unless you're fully comfortable in your own skin. And so, you have to do that hard work to, own who you are and trust that, God gave you the ability to connect with others. So anyway, just some thoughts. And thank you very much.